Thank you, Arvind, and good afternoon to all of you. I hope you'll got some respite from intellectual activity over lunch and are ready for the next round, as it were, of some intellectual stimulation. We had originally advertised this panel as being a discussion on US-India relations. And it was going to be a conversation between Dr. Rajamohan, Ambassador Teresita C, Schaffer, and myself. Unfortunately, and this is really the sign of the times, Raja has come down somewhat indisposed and could not make the trip from Delhi to New York. And that was unfortunate because I did want him, given his broad vision of Indian foreign policy and the things that he has written about over the years, to be present with us today. So what we've done is we've made two modifications. I am going to start by having a conversation with Ambassador Schaffer, and we are going to broaden the discussion beyond the narrow topic of US-India relations to a broader question of India's foreign policy. And of course, the United States is never going to be far from the scene because almost every aspect of India's foreign policy these days intersects with the United States in some way or the other. And I'm really delighted that we can focus on the broader questions of India's foreign policy because Ambassador Schaffer is a long student of India. She has been, in her previous incarnation, a career Foreign Service officer. She is one of the State Department's leading South Asia experts. She served in many of the countries in the region, including Pakistan and India, served as our ambassador to Sri Lanka. And in the State Department, in the old days before the South Asia Bureau was reformed, was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for South Asia, which was actually the highest operating position with responsibility for India and the subcontinent. So Teresita Schaffer is perfectly well positioned to talk about the subjects that I want to talk to her about. And I'm going to spend about 20 to 25 minutes in a conversation between ourselves, and then I want to open the floor to all of you. And I suspect that many of the issues that came up in the very first panel are likely to recur, but we will approach them from a different perspective because we had two Indian politicians telling us about how India sees the world. And I thought at this panel we could bring the United States in as an active participant, as it were, in this conversation. So thank you very much, Stacey, and really glad to have you here with us.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
Wonderful. I'm going to start by asking you a question that I have often thought about and never been able to satisfactorily get my hands around, which is for all of the challenges that India has faced, especially during the Cold War period, when it was a relatively weaker power. It still managed, nonetheless, to protect its core equities with remarkable effectiveness. And I've often thought that part of that was structural, but part of it had to do with the quality of India's diplomacy, and in particular its diplomats. Now, over the years, you've had plenty of opportunities to engage with India's diplomats. And so if I were to ask you the undiplomatic question of how you think about the quality of India's diplomacy over the trajectory that you've seen it, and what are the big challenges facing Indian diplomacy today, how would you address that question?
Well, actually, let me start with the question you started with. Paradoxically, why did India do so well at a time when its power was relatively weak? I think there are two parts to the answer. One is that it was neither big and powerful enough to cause fear among other large countries, nor small enough to be irrelevant. The other question is, what part did its diplomacy play in? Well, the other part of the answer to that question is the quality of its leadership. Even those who institutionally don't like the first Prime Minister of India, he put India on the map in a current geopolitical sense. And I think that counted for a lot. He was also an eloquent man. And he spoke a lot about the idea that was his big contribution to the foreign policy world, namely non-alignment. One of our speakers this morning said that everyone knew about it, but not everyone maybe took it seriously. I certainly think the Indians took it seriously. And the Americans took it seriously enough that we were kind of a combination of troubled and annoyed by it, because that was definitely India marching to its own drummer. And my late husband wrote in a book on Chester Bowles that Nehru had returned from his first visit to the United States in 1949 saying, "No one should ever make a first visit to the United States." And he had not had a particularly good time because people kept peppering him with questions, to which the answer wasn't necessarily non-alignment. But the quality of India's diplomats, that is certainly a constant. My late husband and I also wrote a book, about half of which was devoted to India's negotiating style. Now, what you're getting here is an American perspective on it, but you'll see that that gives you both a perspective on India's negotiating style and on how the United States conducted itself and how good or ineffective they both were. But in the early years, when the Indian Foreign Service was really just getting started, all of the incoming probationers met the Prime Minister. And there's always been a tight link to the top, but the top hasn't gotten quite to the top in recent years. But the point that it always gets to is the Foreign Secretary. And I can assure you that the youngest Indian Foreign Service officer has a great deal more to do with the Indian Foreign Secretary than his or her American counterpart would with the protocol equivalent, whether you define that as the Deputy Secretary of State or the Undersecretary. What are the strengths of India's diplomacy? Well, part of it is this, and that also breeds great self-confidence in India's diplomats, which is a bit misleading because they also tend to be very conscious of their own vulnerabilities. But right at the head of the list of their strengths, I would put meticulous preparation. I think the clearest example of that was an interview I had with India's then ambassador in Beijing, who had been deeply involved in the negotiation of the India-US nuclear deal, which stands as one of the great diplomatic achievements for both countries. And the good ambassador said to me, I asked him whether it was hard dealing with the Americans. He said, well, you're very transparent, and that's what made it much easier. For instance, you have 43 nuclear operating agreements, the so-called Section 123 agreement. I have them all. I still have the binder with all of them. I doubt that his American counterparts had a binder with all 43, which they might usefully have used. They tend to be very good at drafting. They almost without exception have a sufficient command of English, not just to get along in a professional sense, but to recognize ambiguity and subtlety and all of that stuff that goes into drafting a document that you want someone else to agree with. That has stood them in very good stead in multilateral settings, but also in bilateral settings. They tend to stick with a certain grimness to very detailed positions that have been set back in the mists of history. Two good examples of that. And I think the first one started with Jagat Mehta, who started his career negotiating for India, which was the title of the book he wrote, early on. And he recounted how he had objected to the proposed joint statement at some meeting or other, I think with Pakistan, in which Kashmir had been referred to as a dispute. And he literally waited outside for the Prime Minister to drive away in his car and said, "Mr. Prime Minister, we can't say dispute because that suggests that there's some legitimacy to the other side." And the Prime Minister asked him what he would suggest, and I've long since forgotten what the alternative suggestion was, but to this day, dispute is considered an unacceptable word, and Secretary Subramaniam is nodding his head in agreement. I didn't make this up. Another example comes from one of the last phases of the India-US nuclear deal. The choreography was that the Nuclear Suppliers Group was going to pass a resolution saying that it would authorize, in the Nuclear Suppliers Group's export controls, civilian nuclear commerce to safeguarded facilities in India. Everybody knew, very much, including the Indian foreign minister of the day, that unless India reiterated its pledge not to test, or at least not to test for now, there's all kinds of qualifications you can put on that, this resolution wasn't going to happen. India was doing cartwheels to avoid creating any sense that this was a required step and that its commitment was anything less than fully voluntary. And in the end, the statement was made, I believe, the day before the vote on the Nuclear Suppliers Group resolution was to be taken, and in a different venue. And everybody understood exactly what was going on. India was able to maintain the voluntariness of its commitment. There was yet another example in the negotiation for the civil nuclear agreement. Normally, agreements of this sort have a termination clause. Either side may terminate if they do A, B, and C. According to US law, if there was a termination clause, the United States was going to have to list under the A, B, and C if India tests. And the way around that was, what was it, 3 pages single-spaced, 4 pages single-spaced? It was some large amount of text that described what the consultation processes were if either side wished to invoke their right to terminate the agreement. But they never spelled out the conditions that would automatically lead to that. And when asked about it, Nicholas Burns, who is now U.S. Ambassador in Beijing, but was at the time our principal negotiator for the nuclear agreement, and Nick, who had been Department of State spokesman for a year and a half and had been through all of the travails that one goes through in that kind of job, said, India reserved the right to test, and the United States reserved the right to respond. And that's all he would say. No elaborations, no nothing. So that last example is interesting because it shows you nobody gave Nick instructions to do that. But he, as an experienced US diplomat who had been a department spokesman, decided that this was the best way to answer it, and he just did it. And he was adapting to some things that were really important procedurally for India. And one of the speakers earlier today mentioned that this was something that was very important to India. There's a whole long thesis one could write on the language that showcases national dignity. And I think somebody injected this directly into the DNA of Indian Foreign Service officers, where it is used very effectively. India began purchasing military equipment from the United States sometime after the relationship warmed up. And the quantum of arms that have changed hands is actually quite considerable. In the view of the US government, an arms supply contract is a package deal and goes with 3 so-called foundational agreements, one of which deals with security of American classified information, one of which deals with logistics. I've forgotten what the third one is.
I think communication security.
Communication security. And they all have unpronounceable acronyms. And the US has whole file cabinets full of templates for essentially exactly the same agreement with everybody. The first negotiators had the misfortune of saying, everybody signs these. And the answer came back, I think, not in these words, but in this music, we're not everybody. And they went round and round over the space of approximately 10 years and a huge number of military procurement contracts. Somebody got the bright idea of changing the name on one of these foundational agreements. I believe it was the logistics one.
Yep.
This was when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State. And, I mean, we'd had all the explanations. Yes, the British signed this wretched thing. Yes, the Israelis signed this wretched thing. Nothing was having any luck. A change in name and a few minor changes in language later, Hillary Clinton got to sign the agreement. And honor was preserved. The other thing that emphasizes is India's uniqueness. And this is something that the US had some difficulty figuring out how to deal with. Because, of course, we consider that we are unique. We were the first democracy. We were an extremely, by then, powerful country. And we were accustomed to thinking of ourselves as a leader, which implies that there are followers. And not only that, but most of the people who were, in some respects, followers were countries that were noticeably less powerful than ourselves, and with whom we had a very shared sense of global risk. India wasn't going to be put in that box for love nor money. India had a similar sense of uniqueness, which arose not out of being the first democracy, but out of being a 5,000-year-old civilization to which, in their judgment, the US didn't pay enough attention. And I don't mean that in terms of familiarity, but just deep respect. So Where was I? I was thinking of respect. So, yeah.
Daisy, let me use that as a jumping off point to go to a broader question.
Okay.
We have now been working with India for 20 years at a remarkable level of intimacy. How is it that we still get each other wrong on so many counts?
I think a lot of these things have something to do with it. And, you know, both sides have in some respects gotten it, kind of one issue at a time, one workaround at a time. But there's one other way in which our expectations are out of sync. And that is the impact of democracy on the political impact of many of the issues that we deal with. Iran. Iran is a toxic issue for the United States. Has been since 1979, since the Islamic Republic came in, and has been in a particularly forceful way since the Trump administration. For India, Iran is a country with which they have good relations. It's a big Muslim country. There is a not inconsiderable Shia population among India's Muslims. And so it is politically popular and possible for Indian leaders, political leaders, to, speaking undiplomatically, make nice with the Iranians. And every time this happened for a long time, we would get letters from the Congress and from congressional leaders who, in the main, have been reasonably supportive of the relationship with India, but who didn't want to put up with India saying nice things about a country that we considered hostile and nasty. And I don't think there have been any for instances recently. I don't think India has abstained from saying nice things about Iran on our account. It may be the issue has lost something of its power, but we are starting to learn not to speak so much about things that we know are going to be toxic in the other country. That's the best example I can think of that sort of thing. Oh, the other place where our democratic backgrounds bring us to a parting of the ways, the U.S. likes to encourage other countries to become democratic. I don't think India has ever seen democracy as an export product. It will give technical assistance to countries asking for it. But India's decision to join the, what was it, the Coalition of Democracies, I think must have caused a fair amount of heartburn.
Let me, first I want to corroborate everything that Daisy said, because the last 20 years for the United States have been a learning process in trying to deal with this unique animal, which is India, and which is very much like ourselves. The questions about language, the very important priority placed on the recognition of equality, formal equality. All the agreements that we've signed, which we've signed with scores of other countries, are very different in India's case because it takes away the inherent inequalities in the language to make them language formulations of parity, even if substantively India doesn't really bring anything to it. But I want to ask you a question now as we look forward. You talked about the discomfort that the United States had with non-alignment for much of the Cold War. And you also mentioned that we managed part of that discomfort simply because India was not powerful enough to cause us grief, but it was important enough that we had to take it seriously. India now has a new formulation that has replaced non-alignment, and that's strategic autonomy. India is a much more capable country than it was during the Cold War. how will strategic autonomy affect the future of US-India relations? Is this something that the United States will learn to navigate around, or is this going to be yet another thorn in the flesh as we think of our relationship going forward?
I think the answer to that will come from Delhi. I don't think strategic autonomy, if you take it literally, exists for any country, because you can't be totally a free agent in making all your decisions. One former Indian Foreign Secretary, former National Security Advisor, for whom I have huge respect, wrote a very slim volume on Indian foreign policy, which he called Choices. I thought that was a very ironic title, and I don't know whether this was intentional or not, because the Indian foreign policy establishment actually doesn't like to have to make choices. It prefers to find a way of having it both ways. Don't we all? But I think to some extent, as India becomes more powerful, it will probably have to make more of them. To take an example, the last time but one, back to 1990, when India was on the Security Council. It coincided with the Iraq War. And after the Iraq War, there was a flurry of activity in the UN Security Council. Our ambassador there at the time was Thomas Pickering, who is 6'6", has a stride which is equal to 2 of my steps, and is personally just as forceful as that, but he's a delightful guy. And he kept on showing up at the office of his Indian counterpart and asking for support on whatever version of whatever resolution he was pushing at the time. And I remember going to see the Indian ambassador in New York, in Washington at the time. This was Abid Hussain, who I don't know if you know him, but he's a very voluble guy. And he leapt to his feet and he said, "Tazy, do you realize we're going to have to do this for 2 more years?" He'd figured it out. And if you ask people in the foreign policy bureaucracy, do you really want to be on the Security Council? You'll get a rather squirmy answer, because they realize that they will constantly be being put in a position where they have to take a stand. I'm not saying India is shy about taking a stand, but the things that come to the Security Council, there's a side that's for and there's a side that's against. And usually, there are people on both sides that India doesn't want to annoy. So I think some greater comfort with making choices is probably a prerequisite for our living a little bit more easily with it, but we'll manage.
Let me take the discussion to a set of very practical challenges that India faces today. Let me take the discussion towards 3 very practical challenges that India faces today in the US-India context. And the first, which we started discussing in the morning but never quite closed, is Pakistan. India's concerns about Pakistan are well known. The United States has had a long, if somewhat oscillating relationship with Pakistan. Will we ever be possible to have a relationship with Pakistan that satisfies India and a relationship with India that protects our equities in Pakistan?
The challenge in recent years has been to have a relationship with Pakistan that satisfies us and Pakistan, and we haven't got there, at least not in this inning. The U.S. made something of its decision to dehyphenate the 2 relationships. They get hyphenated in Islamabad and Delhi, because both countries tend to look over their shoulder to see whether we're being excessively kind to the other. The substance in our relationship with Pakistan at this point shouldn't give a whole lot of pain to the Indian government. Occasionally you get some military resupply, but there hasn't been a major supply operation in quite some time. We certainly don't give aid and comfort to Pakistan's flirtation with terrorism. I think we've become a little bit less quick on the trigger to respond every time there is a dust-up between India and Pakistan. We don't make that much of a fuss over Pakistan's relationship with China. We've learned to live with that. That could come under pressure at some point. The Chinese, although they talk about their relationship with Pakistan as being higher than the highest mountain and deeper than the deepest sea, that remarkable geographic feat has been accomplished a couple of times when it was clear that Pakistan didn't appreciate, China did not appreciate Pakistan's forward policies, Kargil being the most obvious example. Nawaz Sharif went to to Beijing for what was supposed to be a week's visit, and he came back after a day and a half. Why? Because the only joint statement he could negotiate was one that referred to the sanctity of the line of control. That wasn't what he had in mind. But I think this will probably be a tender spot for us nonetheless, because during the Cold War, Pakistan had always been looking for an ally against India. And we were somewhat closer to that model in the 1950s when we first connected with Pakistan, but got steadily less close to it over the years. India, I think, would like to have us, and it's allergic to allies, so let's not use that word, but as a more reliable voice against Pakistan. And I'm not sure, unless Pakistan does something really awful again, which is always possible, I don't think that we're likely to become much more vocal, because as we see it, we still have some equities in Pakistan which are worth something to be able to try to influence.
And what are those?
Well, it's a crowded country with a weak economy and nuclear weapons. And for years, I think, we have operated towards India on the basis of, if we do things right, good things can happen. And operated towards Pakistan from the perspective of, if we don't get things right, awful things can happen. And so that's kind of the constant.
What about Russia? We've managed to survive an immediate stress test surrounding India's, or at least the appearance of a neutral position in the UN in the UN system. Going forward, as you see it as a student of India, I'm not asking you to answer for the Indian government or anything, but what do you see as the challenges for India given the evolution of the conflict in Ukraine? What should India be concerned about? You as a well-wisher, what would you be pointing to?
Well, the first thing India should be concerned about is the rapprochement between China and Russia. Now, that was supposed to be without limits, and I think what we've heard since then suggests that there may, after all, be some limits from the Chinese side. But that's a real nightmare, because there could come a day when the Russians wouldn't necessarily take India's side against China. The danger in terms of relations with the United States, I'm not sure that's completely over, but it's over for the time being. The U.S. government, and particularly the U.S. Congress, has gotten very quick on the trigger with sanctions in recent years, big difference from when I joined the Foreign Service about 50 years ago. And you have legislation that imposes sanctions or threats of legislation that would enact into law some of the sanctions the U.S. has imposed on the Russians. And there is also talk, there has also been talk of sanctions against India for continuing to buy military supply from Russia. I think the fact that the security relationship is such an important part of the mix, something that was most definitely not the case when I first started working on the subcontinent, gave added force to U.S. pleas to the Congress not to go after us on this, because in the perhaps not so very long term, the United States needed to be wary of what could happen on the China front, and India is an absolutely essential part of that, particularly of the political side of that. That is something that could change. You and I were both involved in a meeting, a trilateral meeting, with some former officials from India and from China. And listening to that, I think we all concluded that the possibility of an actual war was something we could no longer dismiss. Not imminent, I don't want to overstate the case. But that's the real danger.
So in some sense, both countries are involved in a balancing act. India is got dependencies on Russia that it cannot wish away in a hurry, and yet dislikes intensely what the Russians are doing in Ukraine, and is trying to juggle those opposed equities. And we dislike the Indian neutrality with respect to Russia and Ukraine, and yet desire India's cooperation in our own competition with China, which thankfully for us also happens to be India's competition with China. Is that essentially the balance that we're going to be condemned to managing, at least in the foreseeable future?
Yes, I think so.
Let me end by asking you one more question on the China issue. We've never seen India-China relations as bad as they are now since the 1962 period.
And neither have we seen them as, I put a different beginning date on that, but
Absolutely.
since the establishment of diplomatic relations.
Exactly. So we are at this point where India has a very fraught relationship with China, and we are on our way to having a fraught relationship with China. We don't already have one. Yet, that, I mean, by the sheer logic of it, would suggest that Indian and US interests are more perfectly aligned with China than they've been in a long time. Mm-hmm. How far can this alignment take us? Because the question that is often asked in India is, we'd like to do more with the United States, but there is always this shadow of American unreliability. When push comes to shove, you may not deliver. We have a parallel story to tell, which is we would like to do more with India, but it's India's desire not to commit to a fulsome relationship with the United States that sort of keeps us back. So how do we manage this uncertainty which seems to bedevil both sides, even as we have come closer today than we've ever been before?
I think you need to unpack those issues a bit. I understand why India considers the U.S. an unreliable supplier of military equipment. And yet, if you look at what's happened in the past few years, that's clearly been one of the success stories. The U.S. is living with India's current policy on Ukraine, and understands that India doesn't want to tear up all its supply contracts with Russia all at once. If you're worried about unreliability, or if India is worried about unreliability, I think it probably needs in some kind of methodical and thoughtful way to reduce single source dependence. We're not big enough to be the single source that you have to diversify away from. But we are one of the possible alternatives. And I think that, in a way, is also the lesson to be learned from the supply chain disruptions that have followed on Ukraine plus COVID, is not bringing everything home. It is diversifying. India has also had ambitions to be the diversification destination of choice. I think the challenges in front of that for other countries are probably not appropriate fodder for this session, but it's something to think about. Because if there is a time when the investment capital is in some sense loose, you want to make it easy for it to come in. Does that help you?
That does. I'm going to open the floor to anyone who wants to ask convenient and inconvenient questions. Before I do, I want to just pay a tribute to Taisy's late husband, Howie Schaffer, who was also a professional member of the U.S. Foreign Service, who co-wrote 2 books with Taisy together, and both, of course, being very dear personal friends. I would strongly urge you, if you're interested in Indian foreign policy, to look at their most recent book, which is India at the Global High Table, because it covers some very interesting negotiating episodes in great detail with a color and a texture that you will not normally find out there. So I would urge you to take a look at the book. I wanted to just pay that tribute to Howie and to Taisy. And with that, the floor is open. So, yes, sir. Just wait for the microphone so others can hear you as well.
Yeah, I'm Thomas Abraham, chairman of the Global Organization of People of Indian Origin, and I'm involved in the community for the last 50 years. You didn't mention anything about the role of the community and the influence. When we go back to various campaigns, which I am personally involved in, the 1980s Carter administration, nuclear fuel to India. 1988, sophisticated arms to Pakistan, we stopped under Reagan administration. Then under Junior Bush, the biggest campaign we did was for the nuclear treaty. You did not mention. I can tell you definitely that the nuclear treaty would not have gone without the involvement of the community. I personally organized about a dozen town hall meetings with congressmen, senators, so are many other community groups around the country, which you could get a bipartisan support from in the Congress. And without that, that would not have gone through, which I can definitely vouch for that. And also we built up the India caucus, which is one of the largest in the Congress. So even as late as yesterday evening, when we had our local congressman in one of our Gopio, Connecticut meeting in Stamford, that issue brought up many times. Republican administrations were close to India, especially under Trump. Now what happened after Biden came and few congressmen making statements against India, his answer was that the majority Democratic Party is still close relation with India. Some congressmen make some statement that is not part of Democratic Party. So whatever we say, the relation with India and USA will continue, whichever administration comes. But you did not touch upon the role of the community.
You're right.
Which are 4.5 million people now.
I realized that and had a lot of contact with the Diaspora organizations when I was in government. I think you did definitely play a very important role on all those lobbying occasions that you spoke about. And for those of you who have actually come from India, lobbying in this country is a legal but regulated activity. It does not mean suitcases full of dollar bills. I think, so yes, the diaspora plays a very important part. I also believe that the foundation of the improved U.S.-India relationship was built up by both major parties in both countries. And that's one of the reasons for its strength. I know that there was some unhappiness with some of the congressional Democrats. I think you have to sort of unpack that too. It wasn't anti-India sentiment. It was concern about specific issues, one of which was Kashmir, which is bound to be a neuralgic issue for the Indian government and for many Indians. But I'm afraid that's something where you have to expect that individuals, including individual politicians, are going to have a point of view and will feel that there's nothing wrong with their expressing it.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you both. That was absolutely fabulous. My question to the ambassador is about on the continuum of what you called the ability for language to showcase national dignity, if I remember right. On that continuum, you talked about this book called Choices. Mm-hmm. You talked about this word called dispute, mm-hmm. where it inherently tells you something about power. So in that continuum, where are things going now? Because we also have a book called The India Way. So I just want to see how you assess how language is shifting, or is it?
I haven't done a close enough study of this to be able to give you an intelligent answer. I think you look at what's in front of you and think about whether it's appropriate to the moment. It would take a much better lexicographer than I am to be able to do that.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, good afternoon, Ambassador. My question to you is, among the many relations with different countries that U.S. shares, how serious, on a more quantifiable sense, is U.S. relations with India? Does U.S. look at India as a serious trading partner, the one that can contribute to mutual economic growth, or is it mostly an enemy's enemy is a common friend? Because we've seen since the last couple of years that the US is still in the process of appointing an ambassador to India, and it's been sort of more than 3 years since we've not had an ambassador. Whereas China, the US ambassador to China, the process moved a lot more quicker, and we had someone who'd represent US in China. So my question is there a degree of seriousness to this relationship that's beyond just strategic global order?
There is absolutely a seriousness to the relationship. India is approximately number 11 in the lineup of countries exporting to the United States. That's not number 1. It's certainly not nothing. And the change in India's economic policy and in India's economic weight has made a tremendous difference to the relationship. Now, ironically, one of the results is that the security relationship has become both easier to deal with and probably a bit weightier than the economic relationship. On the economic side, you, like every other country in the world, is dwarfed by China. And the ratio of exports to the United States between China and India is approximately 9-to-1. So that's something where the numbers are what they are.
And if I were to paraphrase the ambassador's own formulation earlier, when you look to the future, it'll be hard to make the argument that India is not powerful enough, not insignificant enough anymore. And that by itself should tell you what the impact is on American interests. Yes, sir, right there.
Thank you. This is like a tough question, maybe. In 2 years, we'll be having a presidential election, and if Trump decides to run and if he wins, what do you think is going to happen in terms of foreign policy, whether it's with India, with China, with Russia? If you can give us some scenarios, because I mean, he's going to be coming back with a big vengeance. So what do you think is going to happen?
I think I understood you to ask if the Republicans win the midterms.
No, if Trump comes back.
Oh, if Trump comes back. Well, first of all, that can't happen until 2024. You know, some things about Trump are easy to predict. He will say lots of things that are outrageous. Some things about Trump are harder to predict, which is whom will he like and whom will he not like. You can find things in his past that would support either of those positions vis-a-vis India. Clearly, he liked Modi personally. He tends to personalize many aspects of foreign policy. If he ever thought about H-1B visas and the Indians working in the tech sector, he would probably disapprove. What I can say with some confidence is that it will be an extremely volatile situation inside the United States. I realize that I forgot to answer the gentleman's question about why no ambassador in Delhi. This is attributable to one of the flaws or complications in American constitutional democracy. All ambassadors must be confirmed by the Senate, and the Senate has its own rules, one of which is, and it's just an internal rule of the Senate, that it basically takes 60 votes in order to get a vote on an issue. And Mr. Garcetti, who was in other respects a splendid nominee, was accused of having turned a blind eye to a staff member who was accused of sexual improprieties. And that meant that he had all the Republicans lined up against him and a couple of the Democrats. They haven't been able to change that arithmetic. I'm not sure how much I'd bet on his eventually getting through. I think this is unfortunate. The guy who went to China, Nicholas Burns, was not controversial. This is a function of having a Senate that's divided 50-50, which means that technically the Democrats are the majority party because the Democrats have the administration, which means they have a tie-breaking vote. It is what it is.
I'm going to take one last.
Is not acceptable, then why not propose a new candidate? It's been a year and a half or so.
If I were moving into the White House, you could ask me that question.
It's an answer that hinges on politics rather than anything else.
Yes.
I'm going to take 2 or 3 questions together because I want to bring the session to a close. We have one more session still to go. So all 3 individuals who've raised their hands, if you could ask your questions, and then Daisy,
Okay.
just do a combined answer. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Naya, and I'm a graduate student here at SEPA, and it's such a privilege to hear from you and to participate in this session. And Ambassador, I would like to ask you a question with regards to the broader US-India relationship and how you think gender can or could, and of course has, been playing a role in this broader relationship, whether it's in terms of women's economic empowerment, whether it's enabling and empowering women in the diaspora communities and using that as a leverage, and just more broadly in the US-India bilateral relations. Thank you.
Somebody else behind there? Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Tessa Kirk. I just have a quick question. I understand to this day that we still do not have dual citizenship between the U.S. and India. Do you think, I understand there's OCI, but do you think in the future we will have the chance of dual citizenship in both the U.S. and India?
Can you hear me now? Yeah. I want to go back to the question of why the U.S. and India, at least the political circles, don't understand each other, even after 20 years of swarming up. And I've made my own small efforts to try to do something in that area. The question is the mutual relative ignorance within the political classes about each other a big problem? And how do we solve that? How come there aren't any caucuses on issue areas in the political circles here and there, not just elected members, but political activists and so on and so forth? There just doesn't seem to be this ability to grow out of the so-called strategic realm. And one of the things we wanted to do was kind of have a more people-to-people, but more political-to-political engagement. And if you have any thoughts on how we can actually address that.
And if you could also touch on the question of the strengths and limits of the India caucus on the Hill, because it is the biggest caucus, but there is a temptation to extrapolate from that in terms of its relative power, which is not always accurate.
Okay, how does gender play in U.S.-India relations? India is an example, having been an early mover with having a woman prime minister. It's a country where the average woman does a whole lot less well than the average man. These are things that I'm conscious of. I think that you'll get a natural constituency in this country for the idea of supporting women's empowerment both here and in India. And I think that's probably the most powerful thing one can expect. Dual citizenship. It is simply not accurate to say we don't have it, but it depends on the circumstance. If a child is born in New York of Indian parents, and if that child at birth has Indian citizenship, it also at birth has American citizenship by virtue of being born here. If a child is born in New Delhi of American parents, in most cases, same thing. It depends on the operation of Indian nationality law. So you can't be naturalized in another country and preserve your U.S. citizenship unless the Nationality Act has ended since I last issued a passport. There are limitations in it, but dual citizenship does exist. Mutual ignorance, is it a big problem and can we fix it? Was that a good summary of your? Yeah. I think mutual ignorance will always be there at the popular level. You're not going to have 300-odd thousand Americans having a granular understanding of Indian culture, or 1.4 billion Indians having a granular knowledge of America. The political class, I would start with those who have to make policy or laws about India. And I think the only way to tackle that is one issue at a time. You don't want to start tackling everything at once, but if you have somebody proposing an amendment to legislation that is going to be seen blatantly as an effort to intervene in India's internal affairs, that's when you could have all kinds of people from the executive branch scurrying up to the Hill and saying, you know, this is going to be read differently from the way you intended, and work on it that way. And now that you've got a growing number of Indians in the legislature, they can become part of this process. Also, more congressional travel. The problem isn't as acute in the executive branch because you don't have as many people you have to aim at. That's what briefing papers are supposed to help you do. They're not perfect, but they more or less work. The strengths and limits of the India caucus. The strength is it's a automatic list of people who are predisposed in favor. You can't directly equate that to votes in favor, but it gets you a significant part of the way there. But this is also subject to the mutual ignorance question. I remember testifying in front of Gary Ackerman, who was a charter member of the Indian caucus, and who also, by happenstance, was my mother-in-law's congressman. And he kept asking me these questions that I found difficult to deal with because they were really ill-informed, and I didn't want to sound like a snooty so-and-so in front of a congressman. So I said, well, you know, you're my mother-in-law's congressman, and she always says nice things about you, and so on, and then went on with the rest of my answer. But I remember vividly, it was one of these questions, well, why doesn't India do X, since after all, that's what we want them to do? And he said, well, if we're about to get married, wouldn't you think? And I said, well, I'm not sure thinking about it as a marriage is really appropriate, and so on. I'm not sure I made much impact. That was in the middle of a hearing. But that gives you an idea of what kind of mental models people have, and you can hopefully try to chip away at it.
I'd add two more things to that. One, what the ambassador just said about congressional travel, but I would narrow that down especially to congressional staff. Because very often a staff really does a lot of the spade work behind the scenes.
Yeah.
And getting congressional staff, especially of the key committees, Mr. Abraham knows this better than most, to India is a huge investment in their own education. And hopefully with their education will come better policy making. The second is a little more complicated, and that is we have to be prepared for a discomforting reality, which is that the cleavages that are now manifesting themselves in the Indian political system will find reflections in the cleavages in our own country. And so very often the kinds of things that we tend to dismiss as misunderstandings or inability to sort of comprehend are not really misunderstandings. They are fundamental differences about the political premises on which we conduct ourselves. And I think you're going to see this more and more. And there is no easy fix to that problem. Arvind was kind enough to give us a reprieve of a few more minutes. So if there are any questions still lurking out there, I'm happy to admit them. Rajiv.
This is a very broad-based question. It's not specific with respect to China or Pakistan, but broadly the shape of the geopolitical alliances that you see emerging in response to the mutual security interests or future economic interests that will develop. Do you have a likelihood of how these things could develop, or it's too broad-based subject to visualize?
Ashley, I hope you're going to add to what I say, but I think that it's too early to make real predictions there. I mean, you have what could be the beginning of a rather head-spinning reversal of alliances or of partnerships. Russia, China, India on the horns of a dilemma between Russia and the US, but also worried about China, which is their biggest security challenge. In Europe, I would say the Biden administration has done a really good job of keeping NATO together. Depending on how long the present situation continues, there was a news feed on my phone at lunchtime that said that Russia was announcing that it wasn't going to observe the grain agreement anymore, which is a real problem. But you could see some slippage in that and some divisions then within the EU. And then the question is, how do the countries of Southeast Asia respond? Or Asia Pacific, I'm not particularly worried about Japan, since they are so much in China's doghouse already that they have essentially nothing to gain by trying to move in when Xi Jinping is in a bad mood. But there's a lot of forever relationships, or things that were thought to be forever relationships, that are going sour. That's the kind of thing that could sort of paralyze people, or it could lead to even faster changes. And that's going to affect everything. It's certainly going to affect supply chains. It's going to affect security relationships. When you don't think you'll ever have to deal with a contingency, you don't think much about it. I think we need to start thinking much about it and hope we don't have to.
Does the U.S. focus more on Latin America to prevent China from taking too deep a hold there?
The U.S., I say with my own astonishment, doesn't really think about Latin America with the same part of its brain as it thinks about East Asia and Europe. Latin America is a different part of its brain, and Africa yet another. And I don't think in either case that you would use the word bulwark. And China's been trying to build up its relationships there. Now, that doesn't mean they'll necessarily be so effective, but there was an article in Politico about China playing up to first the Chinese community and then the government in Panama. Now, it happens that one of our good friends is married to a Chinese woman from Panama. So that kind of caught my eye.
I want to just add a couple of thoughts to that, Rajiv. We are going to see an interesting dynamic between tightening alliances driven by security concerns, and yet these very alliances struggling to maintain their cohesion because of economic concerns. And you see this, for example, clearly with respect to NATO. So NATO is completely unified with respect to Russia on security, but NATO members have asymmetrical dependencies on Russia that they cannot get rid of. NATO, with a lot of encouragement by the United States, has now begun to think of China as a systemic competitor, which is actually a new transformation, because the Europeans kept us away from the China question for decades. But when you look at key players inside NATO, like Germany, for example, their dependence on the China market is so profound that Germany could single-handedly gut the consensus within NATO about China, because German businessmen are not willing to give up on the Chinese market and so on and so forth. Absolutely. And this goes back to the question that we were discussing in the first panel today, which is, when you are economically linked to your adversaries, what does competition actually mean in that context? India faces that with China. We face that with China. And for all the talk that we've had in the last 5 years now, 6 years, about decoupling, diversification, and so on and so forth, the fundamentals about the linkages between the United States and China are still intact. If you look, for example, at the whole data on reshoring, it is still marginal to the kind of engagement that we have with China, right? India faces this in much more complicated ways. So I see the next decade as really being this accordion-like struggle between certain pressures towards alliance building driven by security concerns, and then these pressures coming up against the constraints of economic interdependence. Because it is very difficult, short of a direct challenge to your security, that a state can make an easy choice between power and prosperity. And the paradox is that even if you want to protect your power, you cannot do so by sacrificing your prosperity, right? So how do you maintain that in an interdependent world? On that cheery thought, I'm going to thank all of you for your rapt attention in the graveyard shift after lunch. I want to extend a very special thank you to Daisy for giving us this tour of the horizon of our relationship with the United States and, of course, broad South Asia. And I'm going to, with Daisy, decamp the floor because we are ready to continue our next panel, which we will do immediately without a coffee break. And if you'll want to get coffee, please feel free to get coffee, but we are going to start, the session will continue. Okay, thank you very much.